I've now owned my Fender Tone Master Deluxe Reverb for nearly 2 years. Do I still love it? I did a video featuring my Fender Tone Master Deluxe Reverb last year. I'll leave a link in the description. For those of you who don't know how I came to own this amp, well, I'll briefly recap. At the start of 2020, my life changed. My back issue reached a point where I could no longer do the things I'd been doing for decades. I began performing seated, and I began looking for a much lighter amp. Well, in the first year, I went to smallish tube amp heads and a single 12-inch cab. This worked well enough, but my amp in 2 pieces was still less than ideal. I really needed to cut down on the number of trips to the van. Fender debuted the Tone Master amps in 2019. And given my situation, in 2020, the reviews, demos, and discussions caught my attention. Now, this was during the period of COVID lockdowns, and I really didn't have any place to try one. So I researched the amps as much as possible. Then, in the spring of 2021, I went ahead and bought one from a large retailer with an easy return policy. Now that I've had the amp for nearly 2 years, I'm going to share my experience. I'll also be addressing some of the questions and concerns that I've been hearing since the amp hit the market. Now, I should point out that I bought the black version with the intention of immediately updating the firmware and installing a Celestion Neo Creamback, which I already owned. All of my research indicated the update and Celestion really optimized the amp. And testing it before and after confirmed these are big improvements. I'll be brutally honest, I didn't love the amp with the original Neo Jensen. If you've played a black one and were unimpressed, well, try the blonde version. Obviously, all my comments are going to be based on that. In my original video, I talked quite a bit about the helpful features. But obviously, the features are useless if it doesn't sound great. And let me preface this by pointing out I have a lot of experience with deluxe reverbs and blackface Fenders in general. I grew up playing blackface Fenders, I've owned a vintage deluxe, and when I toured, especially overseas, many of the backlines offered a choice of Fender reissue amps. And despite playing a vintage super reverb in those days, I soon discovered the deluxe reverb to be the most satisfying of the reissues on offer. So how do I feel the Tone Master compares? Well, for starters, understand the tube versions varied pretty wildly. I mean, everything from so-so to spectacular. The Tone Master is very close to the good ones, though I'd admit, not quite perfect. But here's the critical thing. Sure, in isolation, with no other instruments playing, no bass, no drums, just a guitar and an amp, a good sounding Tube Deluxe is going to sound a little bit better, with a little bit more richness in the mids, and the notes will seem a little bit bigger. But 2 points about that. First, the difference is mostly going to be apparent doing a direct A-B comparison. And second, and way more importantly, once you get into a live situation with all the other instruments at volume, the difference becomes far less apparent. So in my world, where the most important thing is how the amp sounds live on stage or on a recording, I don't feel I'm sacrificing much, if anything at all, in sound or feel. Now, of course, I do play the amp in isolation all the time when I'm here practicing in my studio. But thanks to the attenuation feature, I actually find it to be more satisfying, since I couldn't crank a Tube Deluxe in here without an external attenuator of some sort. And even live at the typical blues venue stage volumes, a cranked Tube Deluxe can be a little louder than I'd like. In fact, I do most shows with the Tone Master on the 12.5 watt setting, which is plenty loud and allows me to clearly hear the other musicians and the vocal monitors. And for recording, I found the line-out IRs to sound nearly identical to the amp mic'd. So the bottom line is, yes, a great Tube Deluxe will sound marginally superior. But for my personal real-world use, I find the Tone Master to be a better all-round choice, and a godsend for my back condition. So now let's talk about the complaints and reservations folks have about these amps, most of which have nothing to do with the sound. The most common complaint I hear is that a tube amp can be serviced, and if your Tone Master breaks, well, it's just landfill. Now, I don't buy any gear without weighing the pros and cons. To begin with, so far there's no evidence these are unreliable in the least. But admittedly, they've only been out a few years, and surely some will fail at some point. That said, the amp is constructed of modules, and according to amp techs, a faulty module can be replaced, and many of the parts are off-the-shelf items. Of course, some are proprietary, like the main processing unit. So it'll really come down to how long Fender will provide parts for the amp. But even assuming the worst, there are a couple of ways of looking at this. First, it's simply not true that all tube amp failures can be easily fixed. Sure, we're used to bad tubes being the most common problem, but modern PCB tube amps can fail in more catastrophic ways. In fact, I have a friend whose very popular tube amp literally melted down beyond repair because the thin circuit boards couldn't take the heat night after night and finally just fried. So while a traditional point-to-point wired tube amp can last as long as we have tubes, I don't really think that applies to the vast majority of tube amps out in the wild these days. But even if the argument were true, at most the Tone Master is no different than your TV, your computer, your phone, or any other piece of modern technology. So I hope you found this entertaining. If so, be sure to give it a like. And subscribing will really help to keep the channel growing. Be sure to check out all of my videos, and I'll see you again very soon.